August 1944, Normandy, France. The fields smell of burning fuel and something worse. Something that sits in the back of the throat and doesn't leave. The wheat that survived the artillery is flattened now, pressed into the earth by tank tracks, and the boots of men running in directions that no longer make strategic sense. A German signals officer, crouched beside a half-destroyed farmhouse southeast of Falaise, listens to his radio. The voices coming through are not calm. They are not the composed transmissions of an army in control of its situation. They are the voices of men watching a door swing shut and realizing, with a particular kind of dread, that they are on the wrong side of it. To the north, Canadian armor. To the south, American forces pushing up from Le Mans, and tightening from the east, Poles, Canadians. A ring being drawn around two entire German armies in a pocket that will become one of the greatest encirclements of the war's Western theater. Zerfall, question that haunts German commanders in the final days of August 1944, is not whether they lost Normandy. They know they lost Normandy. The question, the one Field Marshal Günther von Kluge whispers into his reports with something close to disbelief, is how a Canadian corps, one that many in German high command had underestimated for years, became the hinge upon which the entire collapse swung. This is that story. To understand what Canada's Second Corps did at Falaise, you have to understand what the previous 2 months had cost. The Normandy campaign, launched on June 6, 1944, had not gone the way Allied planners had drawn it on maps in England. The original designs called for rapid inland advances, the early capture of Caen, and a breakout from the Bocage country within weeks. None of that happened on schedule. Cayenne, the city on the Orne River that Bernard Montgomery had hoped to take on D-Day itself, held out through weeks of brutal urban and suburban fighting. The Germans, commanded by Erwin Rommel and later under Günther von Kluge, had correctly identified the British and Canadian sector as the hinge of Allied ambitions. They poured their best armored divisions there. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitlerjugend, the Panzer Lehr, the 21st Panzer Division, the cream of German armored strength in the west, dug in south of Caen, and dared the Canadians and British to come through them. They did come through, but it was not fast, and it was not clean. The fighting around the Verrières Ridge through July 1944 was some of the most sustained and costly action Canadian forces had endured since Dieppe. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, the same division bloodied in August 1942 on that pebbled beach in France, fought yard by yard across terrain ideally suited to the defense. Hull-down Panthers and dug-in 88mm guns. Mortar barrages timed to catch men in the open. Villages that had to be taken house by house. But something was happening beneath the surface of those costly battles that German commanders did not fully register. The Canadians were learning. Every failed assault, every tactical reverse, every painful recalibration. They were being absorbed by a corps commander who had an unusual quality among senior Allied officers. He thought architecturally. He did not just plan attacks, he designed systems. Lieutenant General Guy Simonds was 41 years old in August 1944. He had the bearing of a man who considered wasted effort a personal offense. He had commanded at the divisional level in Sicily, had watched Italian campaign, fighting closely, and had arrived in Northwest Europe with a mental catalog of what didn't work and a persistent, almost obsessive interest in what might. While German panzer commanders north of the Seine were reporting to Berlin that the Canadian Corps remained a secondary concern, a holding force, a sector to be managed rather than feared. Simonds was designing something that would prove them catastrophically wrong. The date was August 7th, 1944, just past midnight. What unfolded in the hours before dawn was unlike anything the Germans defending the Caen-Falaise road had encountered. There were no preparatory artillery barrages that telegraphed the attack's axis. There were no preliminary infantry probes. Instead, the darkness filled with something the German defenders could not immediately identify. The sound of armored vehicles, hundreds of them, moving in columns, navigating by radio beacons and pathfinder flares, pressing south through the night with a precision the bocage fighting had never suggested Canadians were capable of at scale. Simonds had done something audacious. He had converted 76 defrocked priest self-propelled artillery vehicles, stripped of their guns, into armored personnel carriers. Infantry that had always walked into battle, exposed to everything German machine guns and mortars could offer, would now ride. The kangaroos, as they became known, were improvised solutions to a problem that had cost the Allied infantry a staggering and unnecessary toll. More than improvisation, it was the architecture of the assault itself that stunned. Defenders, bombers from RAF Bomber Command marked the flanks of the corridor with fire, while ground-hugging searchlights reflected off low cloud to create an artificial moonlight, Monty's moonlight, the troops called it, that allowed armored columns to navigate while defenders, their night vision destroyed by flashes, struggled to identify targets. The 51st Highland Division and the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division pushed through in the first wave. The armored columns behind them belonged to the 4th Canadian Armored Division and the 1st Polish Armored Division, formations that Simonds intended to pour through any gap like water through a broken dam. In the first hours, the results were spectacular. German forward positions. The 89th Infantry Division had only recently arrived to hold this sector, were overwhelmed by combined armor and infantry moving together, at night, in a way that German defensive doctrine had not anticipated. Units that expected to have warning time, to call in reserves, to establish anti-tank screens, found instead that the Canadians were already among them. By dawn, 2 German defensive lines had been penetrated. But dawn brought its own problem. American heavy bombers, tasked with attacking German positions deeper in the corridor, dropped short. The bombs fell on Polish and Canadian troops pressing forward. The casualties were significant, more damaging than the numbers in that immediate hour was the disruption to tempo, the stall that allowed German tactical reserves, always responsive and always aggressive, to establish a new defensive line around the villages of Bretteville-sur-Lez and Saint-Sylvain. Simonds watched this, with the controlled frustration of a man who had planned for friction, but not for this particular shape of it. The advance, so electric in its first hours, was slowing against the reconstituted line. The 12th SS Panzer Division, battered but not broken, was feeding tanks into the gap. Kurt Meyer, Panzer Meyer, the Germans called him, the young and savage commander of the Hitlerjugend, was doing what he did best, throwing armor at problems and daring the enemy to absorb it. For 4 days, the advance ground forward. Not the clean breakthrough Simonds had envisioned, but a continuous, punishing pressure that wore German armored strength in the sector down to fractions of what it had been. By August 11th, Totalize had advanced the Canadian line to within 15 kilometers of Falaise. It had not been a clean strategic success, but it had done something more important than any single village taken or road secured. It had consumed the last meaningful German armored reserve between Caen and the Seine. Quatorze, Canada's Second Corps pressed south. The broader Normandy campaign was reaching an inflection point that would redefine everything. General George S. Patton's Third U.S. Army had broken out through the Avranches Gap on the western end of the Allied line at the end of July. By early August, American armored columns were racing through Brittany and beginning to wheel eastward, a great sweeping arc that threatened to cut off every German formation still fighting in Normandy from its supply lines and its retreat routes toward Germany. Hitler, with the strategic instincts that had served him catastrophically in the Bavou-Bas East, ordered a counterattack. Operation Lüttich, a panzer thrust toward Avranches to cut Patton's supply lines and restore the German position. It was launched on August 7th. The same night, Simonds sent the armored columns south from Caen. The Avranches counterattack failed. American anti-tank guns, fighter bombers from the 2nd Tactical Air Force, and a failure of coordination between German armored divisions turned the thrust into a killing ground. But the failure did something else. It pushed the attacking panzer divisions further west, into a narrowing corridor that was closing on both ends. The Allied High Command saw the shape of what was possible. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American 12th Army Group, recognized that if Canadian and British forces could push south to Falaise, while American forces wheeled north from Argentan, two German armies, the 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army, could be encircled, trapped, destroyed. On the map, the idea was clean and brilliant. The Germans were operating on interior lines, compressed, with their supply network already shredded by Allied air power. The pocket forming around them was approximately 30 kilometers wide and tightening. The distance between the Canadian spearhead and the American forces coming north from Argentan was less than 40 kilometers. But 40 kilometers of defended Norman countryside, with SS Panzer divisions fighting to keep the escape corridor open, was not a gap that closed itself. Someone had to close it. That task fell to Canada's Second Corps, August 14th, 11:37 in the morning. Simonds launched his second major assault toward Falaise, and this time he had stripped away the elements of the first operation that had cost momentum. No dependency on night navigation. Instead, a massive daylight advance behind a smoke screen, a wall of white, phosphorus, and artillery-generated haze that would blind German anti-tank gunners while Canadian armor and infantry rolled through. The Laison River Valley in concentrated columns. The scale of the assault was difficult to absorb from ground level. 4 armored regiments moving in parallel columns, infantry riding in kangaroos behind them, artillery firing a rolling barrage ahead that walked the German defensive line backward in real time. The Germans defending the Quesnay Wood and the Laison crossings had prepared layered anti-tank defenses. They had Panthers dug in hull down. They had 80 mm flak guns converted to ground use, the weapon that had made the desert campaigns so costly. They had experienced crews who had been fighting in this sector for weeks. What they had not prepared for adequately was the scale of what was coming, or the manner in which it was coming. The smoke screen that Simonds deployed was thicker and deeper than anything used in Totalize. The German anti-tank gunners, trained to engage at range, found their visibility collapsed to meters. By the time Canadian armor was close enough to engage, the engagement was no longer long-range precision. It was brutal and close and loud, and decided largely by weight. Again, Allied bombers dropped short. Again, Canadian and Polish formations, took casualties from their own air support, a recurring horror of the Normandy campaign that Simonds, furious in his understated way, absorbed without letting it break his operational concept. By evening on August 14th, the Liaison River had been crossed. By August 16th, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division's reconnaissance elements were inside Falaise. The city itself, reduced by bombing to rubble and smoke, was cleared in street fighting that consumed 3 days. The 6th Canadian Infantry Brigade moved through Falaise block by block, the 12th SS Panzer Division fighting delaying actions in the ruins until the position became untenable. On August 17th, Falaise fell. It had taken 2 major operations, 8 days of brutal fighting, and a cost measured in hundreds of Canadian dead to reach a city that had been a D-Day objective 2 months prior. But what mattered now was not Falaise itself. What mattered was what Falaise represented. The door of the pocket was half closed. The other half, the gap between Falaise and Argenton, was where the story of the Second Corps would reach its decisive moment. Military historians have spent decades analyzing the Falaise Gap, the corridor that remained open between the closing Allied forces and the decisions, hesitations, and command failures that allowed portions of 2 German armies to escape. It is a complicated picture. American forces halted at Argenton on orders, the reasons for which remain disputed. British forces pressed from the north and west. Canadian and Polish formations moved to seal the eastern end of the pocket. The gap, at its narrowest, was roughly 15 to 20 kilometers of road and field through which German forces were streaming eastward, not in organized retreat, but in something closer to controlled panic. To understand what the Germans were experiencing inside the pocket, you have to set aside the clean language of operational reports and sit, for a moment, in the reality of it. The road from Falaise to Train to Chambois, the corridor the Germans called the Corridor of Death, was under continuous Allied air attack. Rocket-firing Typhoons and Spitfires flew rotating patrols over it, attacking any column that moved, in daylight. The road itself had been blocked repeatedly by burning vehicles, and units trying to bypass using farm tracks and fields found those approaches registered by Allied artillery. German commanders inside the pocket were not passive. They were experienced, and many of them were desperate in the way that produces dangerous improvisation. General Paul Hausser, commanding the 7th Army, had been a founder of the Waffen-SS. He was wounded during the pocket fighting, shrapnel that destroyed part of his jaw. He continued to direct operations from a stretcher. He was not a man who accepted encirclement as the end of the story. General Heinrich Eberbach, commanding the 5th Panzer Army from the inside of the pocket, was coordinating the attempts to punch through the closing Allied ring from the east. German forces outside the pocket were simultaneously attacking in the opposite direction, trying to hold the corridor open long enough to evacuate armor and men. Field Marshal Walter Model, who had replaced the increasingly despairing von Kluge on August 17th, watched from outside the pocket and understood, with the cold clarity that had made him Hitler's preferred crisis commander on the Eastern Front, that the situation was beyond retrieval. The best that could be achieved was the preservation of enough men and equipment to rebuild shattered formations for the defense of Germany itself. Von Kluge, relieved of command, drove east. He never reached Germany. He took cyanide on the road, leaving behind a letter to Hitler that contained, buried within its careful language, the closest thing to an honest operational assessment any senior German commander had offered in years. He had done his best, the letter said. But the enemy had been stronger. He had done his best. But the Canadians had not stopped. Here the story requires a pause, because the closing of the Falaise pocket was not achieved by Canada alone. To tell it accurately is to tell it with the 1st Polish Armored Division alongside the Canadians, a formation whose history is impossible to separate from the weight of what Poland had already endured by August 1944. The 1st Polish Armored Division had been formed in Scotland from Polish soldiers who had escaped through Romania and Hungary, through France, through whatever route was available after September 1939. They were not fighting for territory or operational objectives in any abstract sense. They were fighting with a personal fury that their British and Canadian allies recognized and respected. Assigned to Simonds' 2nd Corps for the tractable phase of operations, the Polish armor performed one of the war's most extraordinary feats, and its most costly, in the final days of the Falaise encirclement. The 1st Polish Armored Division, with elements of the 4th Canadian Armored Division, was tasked with driving east to close the pocket at its narrowest point. The key objectives were the towns of Trun and Chambois, small Norman towns that sat astride the last viable German escape route. On August 19th, the Poles reached a feature they named Hill 262, the Mgzuga, the Mace. It sat above the escape corridor like a watchtower, offering observation over the roads below and the ability to call artillery onto anything moving through the gap. The 9th Polish Armored Regiment climbed the Mace on the evening of August 19th and took the position in a fight that moved faster than resupply could follow. The next 48 hours tested the Polish division in ways that no training had fully prepared it for. German forces, desperate to keep the corridor open, attacked the Mace from multiple directions simultaneously. Inside the pocket, formations tried to break through toward the hill. Outside, SS units attacking from the east attempted to relieve the pressure. The Polish armor and infantry on the Mace were cut off, unable to be reinforced, running low on ammunition and fuel, fighting a close-range battle that at times came down to individual tank versus individual tank, at ranges measured in tens of meters. In Chambois itself, American forces of the 90th Infantry Division met with elements of the Polish division on August 19th. The handshake at Chambois, the physical closing of the pocket, is one of the war's more quietly significant moments. Two Allied forces, one American, one Polish, reaching across a road and completing a ring around two German armies. But the ring was thin, and the Germans were not finished. The breakout fighting of August 20th to 21st was among the most violent and concentrated of the entire Normandy campaign. German forces inside the pocket, organized into columns that ranged from a few hundred men to formations several thousand, strong, pushed toward the gap with a controlled desperation. They were supported, on occasion, by armor, the last operational tanks of formations that had once been considered the finest armored force in Europe were thrown into the breakout attempts as battering rams. The terrain through which they pushed was horrifying. The roads and fields of the corridor had been under air and artillery attack for days. Vehicles had been destroyed in place, creating obstacles that slowed subsequent movement and concentrated the columns into narrow lanes. Dead horses, the Wehrmacht still depended heavily on horse-drawn transport, lay in the fields alongside burned-out trucks and half-tracks. The stench was extraordinary, reported consistently by soldiers on both sides who passed through. The area in the days after Canadian, Polish, and American forces held the ring with what they had: artillery, tank fire, and infantry in dug positions. The breakout attempts succeeded in places. The gap was never hermetically sealed, and the fluidity of the mobile battle made absolute containment impossible. Portions of the 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army did escape. Some of the most experienced German soldiers in France, the men who would slow the Allied advance toward the Rhine in the autumn of 1944, got out through the gap in those frantic hours, but most did not. The estimates vary by source, but the broad shape of the accounting is consistent. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers were captured in and around the Falaise pocket. Another 10,000, perhaps more, died within the encirclement or in the breakout attempts. The material losses were catastrophic and unrecoverable. Armored vehicles, artillery pieces, trucks, horses, supplies. An entire army group's worth of heavy equipment was left in the fields of Normandy. Generals Hausser and Eberbach escaped. Hausser through the gap itself, wounded and carried. Eberbach was captured shortly after, further east, when his command post was overrun. The accounts of German officers who survived the pocket are remarkable in their specificity about one recurring theme: surprise at the scale and coherence of Canadian operational performance. This requires some context to understand properly. German military culture in 1944 retained, even in crisis, a strong institutional sense of hierarchy, not just of rank, but of national military tradition. The British Army was respected, if sometimes held in patronizing regard, for what German officers perceived as an excessive caution. The Americans were considered powerful but inexperienced, quantity without quality, at least in the German estimation of 1944. The Canadians occupied an ambiguous space in German assessments. They were Commonwealth troops. They had been at Dieppe, which, in the German rendering of that disaster, was simply further evidence that the Canadians were capable of courage, but not of sophisticated operational command. Falaise shattered. That assessment, General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach, in post-war interrogation and memoir accounts, acknowledged that the speed and coordination of the Canadian armored advance, particularly intractable, had exceeded what German planning had allowed for. The double envelopment, the maintenance of pressure on two axes simultaneously, the integration of air support despite its tragic friendly fire incidents. These were the operational signatures of a corps that had adapted rapidly and completely from the costly lessons of July taught Kurt Meyer, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Division, the formation that had fought Canadians from D-Day onward with particular ferocity, was captured near Namur, Belgium, in September 1944. His post-capture statements and later memoirs convey a man who never fully reconciled his initial contempt for Canadian soldiering with the operational reality of what he had just experienced. Meyer had earned his reputation fighting on the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht at its peak had operated with a fluidity and aggression that had destroyed multiple Soviet armies. He had brought that aggression to Normandy and applied it with genuine effectiveness against the 2nd Canadian Corps through July. By August 21st, his division, once one of the Wehrmacht's elite armored formations, had been reduced to fewer than 500 men and roughly a dozen operational tanks. The formation that had driven into Poland in 1939 with hundreds of vehicles and thousands of trained men was, for operational purposes, destroyed. Guy Simonds had broken it. It is worth pausing here to consider the commander who made this possible, because military history has not always given Simonds the prominence his operational record warrants. Guy Granville Simonds was born in England in 1903 and raised in Canada. He graduated from the Royal Military College at Kingston and spent the interwar years in the kind of low-intensity professional obscurity that marked the Canadian military in the 1920s and 1930s, a period when defense budgets were minimal and doctrinal development was largely theoretical. He arrived in the war with exceptional analytical intelligence and a willingness to question inherited assumptions that was unusual in an institution where deference to British doctrine was the default posture. He had studied armored warfare carefully. He had observed the failures of Allied armor in North Africa and Sicily, not as a distant spectator but as a divisional commander who would have to translate lessons into operational plans. The kangaroo APC concept that he pioneered, converting artillery vehicles into armored infantry carriers, is sometimes described in military history as obvious in retrospect. It was not obvious in prospect. It required the recognition that a fundamental problem in combined arms warfare, the EU's infantry's exposure during assault, could be addressed not by better fire support but by structural innovation in how infantry was transported. The British and Americans would follow the kangaroo concept in their own formations, but Simonds created it out of necessity and intelligence in August 1944. His operational architecture for Totalize and Tractable, night assault, smoke, searchlight, navigation, armored columns on narrow frontages reflected an understanding of how to concentrate force in a way that overwhelmed German tactical responses before they could be organized. It was not elegant in execution, because the battlefield never is. It was sound in concept, and it worked. What is perhaps most telling about Simonds is that he extracted from every reversal, the short bombing, the stalled advance, the SS, counterattack, information that adjusted his next operation rather than excuses that justified the previous one. That quality, almost clinical in a man whose temperament could be described as reserved to the point of frost, was the foundation of the operational performance that sealed the pocket. He was 41 years old. He was commanding the corps that closed the Falaise gap. He would not receive the recognition that his British or American counterparts accumulated in the decades of post-war historical writing. But the German panzer commanders who watched his formations close the road to the Seine knew what they had encountered. There is a dimension of the Falaise story that operational analysis alone cannot capture, and it belongs in this account because the men who lived it, on both sides, carried it for the remainder of their lives. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, visited the Falaise pocket area shortly after the fighting ended. He was a man who had seen military catastrophe documented in photographs and briefings. He was not, by that point in the war, easily shocked. He later wrote that it was possible to walk for hundreds of yards, stepping only on dead men and horses, that the landscape had been so thoroughly worked over by artillery and air attack that it did not look like ground anymore. It looked like something that had been processed, compressed, turned inside out. For the German soldiers who had been inside the pocket, the experience of those final days carried a quality of nightmare that conventional military language struggles to contain. The orders still came from headquarters. The radios still functioned, partially. Senior commanders still issued directives in the professional language of the German military. But the directives were increasingly disconnected from the reality on the ground, a reality in which formations had been reduced to fractions of themselves. Supply had collapsed days ago, and the Allied air forces owned the daylight hours completely. The horses died in particular numbers. The Wehrmacht's dependence on horse-drawn transport, a product of German industrial limitations and pre-war planning assumptions, meant that tens of thousands of horses were trapped in the pocket alongside the men. They could not be hidden. They could not disperse. They died in the fields and on the roads, in numbers that made the landscape of the aftermath unlike anything in the European war outside the Eastern Front. For the Canadian soldiers who entered the pocket area as the fighting ended, following the armored formations through the gap at Chambois, the experience left marks that appear in diaries and post-war oral histories without the language of operational analysis. Young men from Ontario and Quebec and Saskatchewan and British Columbia, many of them in their early 20s, moving through terrain that smelled of death and gasoline and smoke, stepping over equipment that had once been the finest army in Europe. They had helped put it there. The precise accounting of the Falaise pocket remains debated by historians, but the general shape of the outcome is not in serious dispute. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. Between 10 and 15,000 were killed within the pocket or in the breakout attempts. The material losses were of an entirely different order. The Germans lost most of their heavy equipment in France. The 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army emerged from the pocket as administrative shells. Their unit designations still existed. Their command structures, in skeleton form, still functioned. But the men and machines that had given those designations meaning were gone. It would take months for the Wehrmacht to reconstitute these formations to even partial effectiveness. The units that fought the Allies on the German border in the autumn of 1944 and through the winter were built around the survivors of the Falaise pocket, stiffened with replacements who lacked the combat experience of the men left behind in Normandy. The Royal Canadian Army, for its part, had taken serious casualties in the operations that closed the pocket. The 2nd Canadian Corps, across Totalize and Tractable and the subsequent fighting to close the gap, had suffered thousands of killed and wounded. The 4th Canadian Armored Division and the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, the formations that bore the heaviest operational load in the advance to Falaise, paid a price that the official records document and the personal memorials in Canada reflect. The 1st Polish Armored Division, holding the mace under conditions that bordered on impossible, had suffered casualties proportionate to the ferocity of what they had faced. Their losses at Hill 262 were, in relation to the size of the formation, engaged, among the highest of any Allied action in the closing days of the Falaise operation. These numbers matter not because they are the measure of success. That calculation is too cold for what these men endured, but because they are the weight of what the closure of the pocket actually cost. It was not handed to the Canadians. It was taken. The Falaise pocket closed. The Allied armies turned east. The speed of the subsequent advance was, in part, a product of what the pocket had done to German defensive capacity. The formations that might have held the line of the Seine, that might have bought time for a coherent defensive position, were prisoners, or dead, or reorganizing in fragments. The river that German planners had hoped might serve as a barrier instead became a crossing point. Allied forces reached it before its defensive potential could be organized. The Canadian Corps, after the exertion of the pocket operations, was among the formations that pressed forward. The advance through France toward Belgium that followed was, in pace and character, different from what had preceded it. The brutal attritional fighting of the Bocage and the Falaise advance gave way to mobile operations, towns liberated, prisoners taken in numbers, civilian populations emerging from cellars to find the Canadians had arrived. For many of the men of the 2nd Corps, that sprint through France in late August and early September 1944 was a vivid contrast to what had come before. The experience of movement after 2 months of grinding advance, of seeing the operational concept actually function at the speed it was supposed to function. But the war was not over. Belgium and the Netherlands lay ahead. The Scheldt Estuary, another grinding, methodical, costly Canadian battle, waited in October. The Gothic Line in Italy was still being contested by the 1st Canadian Corps. The fighting that remained was serious and costly, and would add substantially to the lists of Canadian dead before May 1945. What the Falaise pocket represented was not the end. It was the moment when the outcome of the war in the West became, operationally, irreversible. Germany could prolong the fighting. It could not reverse the result. The decision that produced that irreversibility was made, in significant part, by the 2nd Canadian Corps and the operational mind of Guy Simonds. The history of the Falaise pocket in the popular literature of the Second World War has often been told through the lens of what went wrong, the gap that remained open, the Germans who escaped, the hesitation at Argentan. It is a legitimate critique, and the debate over responsibility for the incomplete encirclement has produced substantial historical literature. But that critique, however valid in operational terms, has sometimes obscured what went right, and specifically, what Canada did right. The transformation of the 2nd Canadian Corps between the costly reverses of July and the operational success of August 1944 is one of the more remarkable institutional adaptations of the Northwest European campaign. The speed of that adaptation, the invention of the kangaroo, the redesign of assault methods, the maintenance of operational tempo through setbacks that might have broken a less resilient formation, reflected qualities in both the command and the men that deserve more sustained recognition than they have typically received. Guy Simonds designed operations that outpaced German tactical responses. The soldiers of the 2nd Corps executed them under conditions that were as difficult and costly as any faced by Allied formations in Normandy. The Poles who held the Mace, surrounded and outnumbered, contributed something that the official operational accounts tend to reduce to statistics. The German panzer commanders who watched the pocket close around them were not fools. They were experienced, skilled, and, in many cases, genuinely talented military professionals who had spent 5 years at war and understood what they were seeing. What they saw in the last week of August 1944 was a Canadian Corps that had taken the lessons of the previous 2 months and converted them into an operational execution that they could not counter. That assessment, the informed evaluation of enemies who had reason to know, is perhaps the most honest measurement available. Falaise, August the 21st, 1944. The fighting has moved east. The pocket is sealed. The roads into it, the roads the Germans called the corridor of death, are silent in a way that the previous weeks have not been. The silence has its own quality, the particular quiet that follows very large violence. A Canadian signals corporal, moving with a forward headquarters element through the Chambois area, writes in his diary that the smell is something he does not expect to find language for. He notes the vehicles, the horses, the equipment that once belonged to formations with names that had appeared in Allied intelligence briefings as threats to be taken seriously. He notes that it is raining lightly, that the wheat in the fields that survived has begun to come upright, again, slowly, after being pressed flat by tank tracks. He does not write about what this means for the war. He's too close to it to see the shape of it. But 50 years later, speaking to a researcher in a living room in southern Ontario, He will say that he understood, in some part of himself, that was not the part filling out forms or routing messages, that something large had been decided in those fields. He was right. The men of Canada's Second Corps, the planners, the armored crews, the infantry who rode the kangaroos, the gunners whose artillery walked ahead of the assault, the engineers who bridged the rivers and cleared the roads, had participated in the operational decision that broke the German army in France. They had not done it cleanly. They had not done it without cost. They had not done it without the Poles alongside them, or without the Americans pressing from the south, or without the British holding the western shoulder of the pocket. But the hinge upon which the door swung shut, the drive south to Falaise, the pressure that kept the German armored reserves consumed and unable to respond, the closure of the gap, that was Canada's work. The German panzer commanders who watched it understood what they had seen. The history that followed, the liberation of Belgium, the opening of the Scheldt, the long push toward the Rhine, was built on what was decided in the fields of Normandy in August 1944. Built in no small part by the 2nd Canadian Corps.